Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 5 of REN-SHEN Half Spirit, The Leaving. The days after the presentation were a blur of terror and mourning for Steve. He wanted to hide from the world and not talk to anyone. His body was sore from the fighting, but that was completely shadowed by an immense feeling of loss. He couldn't find a way to ease his trauma. Sleeping was impossible. His thoughts flashed back to the award presentation time and time again. He'd forgotten the elation of winning the title. It was all replaced with the horror of that day. The senseless deaths kept replaying in his mind, and he had no internal mechanism to switch it off. Each time an event from the fateful day replayed, Steve would be fighting again. If he was asleep, his legs would be kicking and his jaw would be clenched. Waking up would be his temporary release from his captive hell. And when he was awake, his hands would become fists and his body would ready itself for battle. He would see each moment and move another direction or construct sequences which may have produced a different result. Some alternative action which would have let his father live. Something that could have stopped Jake from losing his life. If only he killed Cherry 1 earlier. If only he helped Sensei Mike earlier. Maybe he would have had someone to share his pain with. He had nobody, and it was his fault entirely. The Australian Federal Police paid Steve a visit to discuss the murders at the tournament. Steve was the only witness who saw the entirety of the events leading to the deaths on that horrific day. He didn't admit to taking Sensei Mike's life and completely avoided discussing the supernatural events he experienced. Luckily for Steve, representatives from Interpol recognised the Cherry Blossoms and their leader as organised crime members from Japan. The murders were quickly attributed to the Japanese criminals, and the line of investigation was placed in the hands of international law enforcement organisations. Prior to the tournament, Steve had been anguishing about how he would ask his father to allow him to go to Japan to further his training. He knew the discussion about deferring his studies would not have been an easy one. After the tournament, he needed nobody's permission about anything. He had just turned 18, without celebration, and was an adult under Australian law. He didn't have time to think about his future. He had already buried Sensei Mike. It was a deeply moving farewell, attended by a handful of people, and it only reinforced Steve's sense of deep loss. Jake's funeral was, in some ways, worse than Sensei Mike's. He saw Jake's wife and children crying, and he felt guilty just being in their presence. It was Steve's fault that Jake was dead. His children and wife would suffer forever. The guilt was suffocating. Steve had to leave early. Steve just wanted to escape all of the pain. Whatever the solution was, it evaded him. There was no solution availing itself. New complications and obligations were unfolding every moment. The burden of burying his father was weighing heavily upon him. Steve seemed to alternate between moments of denial and then obligation. He wished he took more notice of traditions and processes. Steve's father was a well-known man in the Macedonian community, and he wanted to make sure he honoured his father. Funeral arrangements were made and he still didn't know entirely what he would need to do. He wanted to make a speech. He didn't know what to say. He was hopeful some of the elders would help with some of the rituals associated with a Macedonian Orthodox burial. It seemed as though time jumped forward in a flash. It was barely a blink of an eye and he was following the hearse, carrying his father's body to the church. As they neared the church, Steve saw all the familiar faces from his local community. It normally gave him a sense of comfort to see them. He wanted to be reminded of uncomplicated times when he saw some of his relatives and friends there, but he simply couldn't escape the horror of that fateful day. The usual faces were indeed there. The first to greet him was crazy old Babarada. Baba means grandmother and is also a respectful term to use for old women, even if they were not related. Babarada was not a blood relative, but she was from the same village back in Macedonia and knew Steve's family very well. As a very young child, Steve used to be scared of Babarada. She used crazy gestures all the time. had a cross tattooed on her forehead, and she was so old. When he was quite young, Steve learned the significance of the cross tattoo. Babadada was indeed old. She was alive back when the Ottoman Turks were in control of Macedonia. The prettiest of the little girls was stolen and sold to rich Muslims in Istanbul. They would then spend the rest of their lives in someone's harem. In order to avoid having their child stolen, it was common to have the Christian cross tattooed on their foreheads. No Muslim would accept a girl so obviously branded as a Christian. Babadada was the last of her kind. Babadada lived down the road from Steve. She would spend her days sitting at the front of her house. Many thought she was quite crazy. She would often just sit in her front porch area and just look at her garden and watch the people passing by. Other children would often mock the crazy old woman as they passed by. Once Steve understood the significance of the tattoo, he developed a sense of the tragedy of his people. He would always say hello to her. She would always greet him enthusiastically. She looked forward to seeing him and would always offer him treats and simply wouldn't take no for an answer. If Steve saw any other child mocking her, he would immediately come to her defense. Babadada greeted Steve in her usual crazy manner. As always, she curtsied in front of him and performed her greeting. She would do the same for Steve's father every time she saw him. Tvoje veličestvo, she would say. It meant, Your Majesty. And she would always smile warmly at Steve when she said it, but always in the most serious manner for Steve's father. Steve asked his father why she did it, and he always dismissed her as being quite mad. Steve thought Babadada's little inside joke was somewhat inappropriate on the day of his father's funeral. Nevertheless, he found it comforting to see her there. Steve and a select few carried the coffin into the church. Babadada was hovering nearby. She seemed to be conducting her own ritual. People would ignore her craziness because she more than compensated for it with her knowledge of the old ways. When it came to tradition and protocols, she was rarely questioned. The coffin was placed near the altar and the lid was removed. As tradition would dictate, it was an open casket funeral, and Steve saw his father once again. His father retained that fierce look of a warrior when he died on that terrible day. The priest was conducting his liturgy only to be rudely interrupted by Babadada. Few could understand her fully at the best of times, but she was even more difficult to understand on this occasion. Everyone tried to quieten her during this very solemn occasion. Why is this crazy woman interrupting the priest? Shit, Steve thought to himself as some of the community elders tried to stop her and move her away from the coffin. She pushed them away with remarkable strength and made her way to the coffin again. She reached in her bag and pulled out a mask painted in gold. It had a 16-pointed sun rosette etched into the forehead area. The rosette was well known to Steve, not only because it was an official emblem associated with Macedonian royalty. It was simply always present in his life, whether it was on a doily or a tea towel or a religious painting in a relative's home. She placed the mask on Steve's father's face. This was too much, even for Steve, as he rose to calm this clearly mad woman. The priest began to remonstrate with her, but she seemed to grow in stature and commanded attention from all that attended the service. Her voice rose and she glared at everyone in the entire church, paying particular attention to the priest. She said, I've attended 4 funerals of the men in this line, 3 in Macedonia, and now this one here in Australia. Maybe I've lived too long and seen too much, but the men of this line have always been buried this way. If anyone thinks they know more than me about it, I'll sit down and let them do what's right. Otherwise, just shut up and stop interrupting me. Steve stood up when Babadada placed the mask on his father. He had every intention of taking off that mask. But when he heard what she knew about the traditions of his family, he quickly realized how little he knew of these things. He yearned desperately for his father's return. He still needed to learn so much. He wondered why he didn't know more about his family's traditions. To add to the grief, he was completely disappointed in himself for not asking more questions when his father was alive. The priest and Babadada maintained their nuanced battle for leadership in the proceedings while Steve motioned towards the coffin to see his father one more time. He looked at the mask and felt compelled to touch it, perhaps to see if it was real gold. It wasn't, but Steve thought it still looked quite impressive, and he certainly didn't want to break with his family tradition, even though he had no idea of it prior to that day. He moved away from the coffin and sat down at the front of the congregation. The smell of the frankincense was almost suffocating. The priest was loading extra frankincense into his thurible and was directing the smoke near Babarada. He seemed hopeful she might faint and allow him to conduct his proceedings without interruption. She continued her deliberate movements and subdued chants without even looking at the priest. She took advantage of the smoke as she tried to wave it into the coffin. She demanded more and used the Macedonian word temyan for it. Steve was reminded of Temyana and had been wondering who she was and why she appeared when she did. He had so many questions for her, if he ever saw her again. He looked up at the coffin surrounded by the smoke, and there was the little girl. She was in a half-gold mask and looked like she was part of the smoke. She would weave in and out of the smoke and was almost transparent on occasions. She seemed to appear and disappear. Steve noticed the mask she was wearing was quite similar to the mask on his father. It had the same emblem etched into it. Steve looked around and wondered if anyone could see what he could see. They all seemed oblivious, except for Babarada. She was looking straight at Temyana, and her chants or instructions were clearly being directed at her. Babarada seemed to be directing her into the coffin, at one stage shouting at her to get in. Temyana was having none of it. She did seem to hover around the coffin, but then looked up at Steve. She gestured towards Steve, said something to Babarada, and she reluctantly complied with the little girl. Babarada retreated back to the congregation and let the priest conclude the funeral rites. As the incense smoke subsided, Temyana's semi-transparent apparition disappeared. Steve had seen so many utterly inexplicable events in the last few days. He knew he needed to find Temyana again, and he was absolutely determined to see Babarada as soon as possible after the funeral. The sadness of that day didn't end with the burial. The feeling of loss and dejection permeated every cell of Steve's body and mind. People tried to visit him over the following days, and he found excuses to avoid them all. He was trying to make sense of the impossible. He was mourning, and the relentless images of those fatal events continued to haunt him. He was not the same person as before the tournament. He wished he'd never competed, and that everything would simply return to the way it used to be. He knew things would never be the same. He could still hear Demon Hiro's voice, and he could still see what happened to Sensei Mike. Even if he wanted to hide his head in the sand and pretend none of it ever happened, he was sure that, when he least expected it, the Demon Hiro would find him. Steve was upset with the injustice of it all. Good men were killed for no reason, and families were suffering. His competing emotions crippled him. On one hand, he wanted justice for the people he cared for, yet on the other hand, his sorrow had depleted him. His energy was at its lowest ebb. After a few days of misery and solitude, Steve was able to muster the spirit to leave his home and seek answers from Babarada. He bought her a cake, a jar of Turkish coffee, and some chocolates. The same chocolates she would always try and force upon him every time he walked past her house as a young child. She was sitting at the front of her house, and the moment she saw Steve, she mustered all her energy to curtsy and say, "Tvoj veličestvo, Your Majesty." She didn't do it in a playful manner as she had always done in the past, with a younger Steve. She did it as though she was still performing the rituals back in the church at the funeral. They went inside her small home, and she immediately began preparing Turkish coffee for them. Steve hated those coffees when he was younger, but as he grew older, the taste seemed to grow on him. That furry, textured, strong hit of caffeine was the only drug he would allow into his pristine body. He thought back to the times he would drink it with his father, and yet another state of sorrow engulfed him as he tried to hide the tears welling up in his eyes. Babarada noticed Steve's change in demeanour and promptly tried to lighten the mood by talking about her life in Macedonia, how many wars she managed to survive, how many languages she could speak, and how many old Macedonian traditions were lost on the young people. She gave Steve his coffee and a slice of the cake he had brought. Steve wanted to talk about the church proceedings and Temyana and everything she knew that he didn't, but Babarada insisted on the coffee being finished first. She kept the conversation as jovial as possible. Sometimes she rambled a little and sounded like the crazy person most people thought she was. Other times, the clarity was almost brutal in its precision. Steve finished the coffee, and Babarada quickly gave Steve instructions. He had to turn the coffee cup upside down and place it on top of the saucer. He had to swirl it 3 times, with intent, and let it settle for a few minutes. Steve was well aware of her intentions. She would read the coffee cups of all the women in the neighbourhood, and supposedly tell them their future. In fact, he was sure it was more of a technique for finding out everybody's business. Steve's father would often joke about her crafty ways. A simple statement such as "I see new money" would reveal someone's inheritance from a relative overseas. "And I see a dark cloud. Is someone unhappy?" Guaranteed a limitless supply of neighbourhood gossip, he said. Steve readied himself for the thinly veiled interrogation. He was willing to put up with the theatre of the process if he was going to learn a few things after that. She picked up his cup and saucer before she even looked at it, said, "You know, I read your father's cup many times. He had a very difficult life, and the coffee grinds barely fell to the saucer. He kept his pain with him all his life. Such a pity. He would have been a powerful leader if he wasn't left alone from such a young age. I tried to help him sometimes in the village, but none of us had anything to give. And besides, he needed something much more important than food." Steve interrupted her and asked, "What did he need?" She said, "He needed a teacher, or many teachers. People who could explain the ways of the world and how it all works. Just as Alexander the Great had Aristotle and his father. Your father needed a great teacher or teachers. If a king lives as a slave, how can he rise? He missed his opportunity. He was too young. And the war." She shook her head and stopped talking, then insisted on reading Steve's cup. She went to pick up the cup and it was stuck to the saucer. "A prophet's cup," she exclaimed. No sooner had she said that, the cup separated from the saucer and the saucer broke in half on the table. She paused for a moment and looked perplexed. She gazed carefully inside the cup. Steve's assessment of his cup was that it was simply brown inside. Babarada, in contrast, was mesmerised by its contents. Her eyes were wide open and sometimes she would ask and answer her own questions. "But the triangle is everywhere and so high, with the sun at the top, and those lines so thick but broken, and the dots and that dark angry eyes, hideous, a knife, 2 moons near the handle." Then she looked at the saucer and nodded to herself as though she had her confirmation. Steve found himself curiously enthralled with the process. He started a skeptic, but quickly became eager to learn about his coffee cup future. "What does it all mean?" Steve asked. Babarada took a deep breath and hesitated for a moment. She looked at Steve and then the cup again as if to check that each were related to the other. She nodded to herself in answer to her own silent question. "Of course, king's blood." She then looked at Steve and said, "The triangle dominates your cup. The sun at the top of your cup with the triangle means your power will grow, and that power will be the change in you. And that there will be a dramatic change in your life. I've never seen such a dominant triangle so high. Your change will happen quickly, but it will not cease. The lines show your path is strong, but it will break. So there will be pain. That eye is evil. Someone will always be looking for you with bad intentions. No, more than one. There are other eyes. The moon shows you will find love, but the knife tells me you'll be in danger. I've never seen so much in one cup, my dear king. It's too much for me. You carry the divine blood, so the scope is broad, of course." Steve couldn't make sense of anything. He only remembered the change and the blood and the evil eye. He asked Babarada, "Why did you put a mask on my father at the funeral proceedings, and how did you know that little girl?" Babarada stood up and pointed a finger randomly around the room. "That little girl is no little girl. Don't even get me started about her. She's a liar and she hides in the smoke. She should have helped your father more. Macedonian stories pass from my Baba to me about her. They say she was the highest Orphic priestess the first time around, and she learnt how to ascend from the cycle of life. But she was bound to King Alexander, who commanded her return. When he passed to the next world, she was meant to go with him as his guide. But for some reason, she's trapped between both worlds. She lied to her king and was not allowed to pass with him. Now she floats between the heavens and earth and hides in the incense smoke. Some call her Temyana, but she's had many names. Don't trust her. She'll always look for you. She's bound to your line and has no choice. But she failed King Alexander, and she'll probably fail you when you need her most. Don't rely on that witch." Steve wasn't really understanding any of the discussion. My line? She's bound to it? And you speak of King Alexander? You mean Alexander the Great of Macedonia? Am I to believe I come from his line? Babadada quickly replied, "Do you think I'm crazy? Why do you think I greeted you all your life as royalty? Did you think I was joking? You are the last living descendant of King Alexander, the last of your line, my king. If I was younger, I'd do anything you commanded of me. Now I'm old and I don't have much time left. You must find your teachers. Your father didn't have his chance, and his coffee cup showed it every time. Your cup is beyond my comprehension. Your future will be memorable, my divine king." The more questions Steve asked, the more confusing and far-fetched the notions became. Babadada could see Steve was overwhelmed with all of the information about his identity and bloodline. She said, "Seek your teachers. Your father gave you every chance to do what he couldn't. Honour him and honour your line." Steve simply didn't know what to believe, but finally made the decision he was agonising over. He would go to Japan to pursue his path and seek his teacher. He hugged and kissed Babadada and thanked her for always being kind to his father and himself. She replied, "It has been an honour, my king." As he was leaving, Babadada tried to return the chocolate Steve brought for her. Steve smiled and didn't even put up a fight. He couldn't refuse her this last time. He knew he would most likely never see her again. He squeezed her hand gently and looked deep in her eyes, as if to keep the memory of her strong in his mind. He caught a glimpse of the beauty that would have condemned her to a life in a harem had it not been for that tattoo on her forehead. She blushed as she smiled deeply and proudly at him. She pretended to spit at him 3 times for good luck and to ward off any evil spirits, and sent her king on his way. There was little to keep Steve in Australia. He would leave his old life behind. His father, his first teacher, who sacrificed so much for him. His second teacher, Sensei Mike, who started his path, and the world he knew. It was time to leave. He would go to Japan with Sensei Mike's letter to seek his teacher and begin his journey. Brothers and sisters of the infinite, thank you for listening to me read through that chapter, The Leaving. We found a bit more out about Temyana. She was there. In fact, her name comes from the word Temyan, which is the translated word of Macedonian, the Macedonian word for frankincense, which if you've ever seen the priests waving the thing around, blowing smoke around to ward off the evil spirits, that's exactly what frankincense is. It's this sort of stuff they shove inside the thurible, light it up, and conduct their affairs. It's been important for a very long time for a number of religions, and you remember the 3 wise men who visited baby Jesus. One brought gold and there's one bringing frankincense. So clearly it's pretty valuable stuff. It was considered valuable in the olden days anyway. Maybe less so nowadays. You might notice the mask was quite an issue in this particular chapter, burying someone with a mask. Burial sites have been found in the region of Macedonia where gold masks are present on the corpses or the skeletons that are found now. And you might think that's strange. Well, where else does it happen? Well, funnily enough, the research I've found suggests there is about 50 times more likely you'll find someone buried in a golden mask in the region of Macedonia than anywhere else in the world. And in fact, it was part of an Orphic ritual. If you know Orpheus, or if you feel like studying up on him, he was an interesting individual who mourned the loss of his wife, and as a consequence went to the underworld begging for her return. She died. And he went and visited Hades, and Orpheus was a beautiful, incredible musician. He went there and said, "Please let me have my wife back." And Hades said, "Well, no, you can't do that." He said, "What if I play you a tune, the saddest tune ever? And if it impresses you enough, please let me take my wife back. Back to earth, back to normality, back to life." And Hades and his wife, they sort of sat around and said, "You know what? Give it your best shot." And he played the most mournful tune. he kind of blew them away a bit. And they said to him, you know what? Done. Job done. That was incredible. Take your wife. Now, run. Get the hell out of here. Now, when you cross the threshold from the underworld back to the normal world, do not look back. Your wife will be behind you. She will be there. Do not worry. Do not look. If you turn around to look, we're taking her back. Have faith. So he's running and he could hear her and whatever else, and he knew that it was all happening. He crossed the threshold and turned back like an absolute fool, only to find his wife was immediately sucked back. He went to grab her just to pull her through, and she was sucked back into the underworld, never to be seen again. And the Orphic traditions were tied into. It became a religion. It became there was a bit of a wine cult associated with it. So, maybe they got drunk really well and really had a good time with it all. But, this preceded Christianity and certainly anything resembling, the First Testament as well, the Old Testament. So yeah, it certainly was a religion in ancient Macedonia. And again, finding people buried with masks, extraordinarily more likely in Macedonia than anywhere else in the world. So clearly they embraced this Orphic cult more than anybody else in the world. That's what the masks are attributed to. So I thought I would use that as a bit of an interesting link back to some antiquity in the region, and adds a bit of intrigue, and it's quite interesting. So it's nice to remember some of these things as we're going along with our incredible path for this young man. So Steve has been given an indication, and this is a bit mind-blowing now. He's been given an indication he carries the divine blood, the blood of Alexander the Great, no less, the great Macedonian king, the one everyone remembers. I think we'll learn a bit more about that as time goes on, but at this point, Babarada, who was an interesting woman, told him about that connection, and that's going to be something that's quite interesting as time goes on. Now, Babarada was an interesting woman. She was basically a combination of people I grew up with in my life, truthfully. There was an old woman who used to come visit with the cross tattooed on her forehead. You must understand the Ottoman era was a terrible time in the region of the Balkans. Basically, there was an industrial revolution going on around the rest of the world. Things were happening, and then you had the Balkans and that region thereabouts, where they were just condemned to slavery pretty much for about 500 years. There were taxes. You weren't technically a slave. You weren't property of the state or property of anybody. Having said that, you were taxed. You had to pay a tax to stop your children from going to war, to become soldiers, to be taken from you, to become soldiers for the Ottoman army. So you had to pay for that privilege so your children wouldn't be taken away, your sons. Your daughters, God forbid they were pretty, they would be taken at a very young age. So in fact, the cross was extremely common. And anyone old enough, and we're running out of those people, knows this as fact in the region. Okay, it wasn't just the Macedonians, but it certainly was. And it was the Greeks, it was the Albanians who weren't Muslim. The Albanians who were Muslim adapted to their environment very quickly. They adapted and thrived, in fact, during that time. So, in fact, if you became a Muslim in that era, you had all the benefits. One, you could actually carry a gun. Two, you could actually speak in courts, and they would listen to you because a Christian's word on anything was irrelevant. In fact, ignored. There was no point listening to them. So you could go to court, but you wouldn't be, nothing you say could have been taken as fact. Only a Muslim's word was taken. So it was an interesting era, and a lot of suffering occurred during that period. So when we think of Babarada, we think of a time that was basically she was the last of her kind. 500 years of slavery under the Ottoman Empire. You know, the tax regime, the inability, you had to get off your horse or your donkey if a Turk goes past, because that would be disrespectful. It gets quite horrific. If you were newlyweds, well, the first night was guaranteed you kept your virginity back in those days. Definitely a different era. And your first night of marriage would find you with the village or the regional leader, who was always an Ottoman Turk, who would spend the first night with your wife. And you know what that would entail. And then you'd be the husband would be waiting on the second night perhaps, or something like that. So what would happen as a consequence of all of that is people would often get married out in the fields, and or hidden weddings, and then, you know, perhaps put a wedding on show later on to confirm the nuptials. So just so that the husband and the wife have their first time together, which is kind of nice. It is nice. It's the terrible thing is what was waiting for them once they got married officially. So a horrific era, horrific. Luckily that's passed, and you can understand why. Even, you know, my grandmother knew some Turkish words, and a fair few Turkish words, and in fact the region was taken over by Greece, so they forced you to speak Greek, and her Greek was actually very poor. It wasn't good at all, because she was in the village and she didn't really have to communicate with anyone other than her local people, and so she still had a few Turkish words that were there from before. So there was a bit of that knowledge, and then some Greek that you'd learn, having been taken over by the Greeks after 1913. And then, so interesting times. So, you know, it's always a delight speaking to older people, really old people from that region. For me, I've always found it fascinating because you learn so much. And the truth of the matter is, it's just not that interesting to people who aren't from the region. Or, you know, it would be interesting, you know, if you get the right camera behind it and the right, you know, plot around it or something, make it into an interesting story. But the way it stands, not many people seem to know about this. And, you know, there was 500 years of terrible oppression in the region, and things didn't get better for the Macedonians for quite some time after that. It's arguable it's never gotten better, so that's a separate discussion. But we are now leaving Australia. Steve Nedelkin has found out some things about his bloodline. He's got no reason to stay. It's time to go. Find his path, seek his teachers. I don't have to give up too many secrets here, but we're going to Japan. Get ready. Spruce up your kimonos. That's for the women. And the men, if they want, they can wear them too. It's time. We're heading to Japan, and get ready for an experience. It's going to be cool. I love Japan. I've been there many, many times, and it's deep in my heart. Very much in love with Japan and the people, and the attitudes. Interesting country. Love it. So, get ready. Book 2 commences shortly, and book 2 of REN-SHEN Half Spirit, which is split into 3 sections, in case that was confusing. I look forward to your return. I look forward to bringing you the next chapter. Thank you again for your attention and interest. It seems some people are highly committed to this process. I appreciate it. Thanks again. See you soon. Bye.